The Pat Fitzgerald news broke yesterday, Dad. And while we talked about it on the show, Northwestern had put themselves in a position where now this was possible. I still truly wasn't sure, in a world where we are only a few years removed from everything that went on surrounding Iowa football and Kirk Ferentz and the allegations of a program that had a culture that was toxic and detrimental, especially to black players on that team. I was wondering if they might try and run the same play. And instead, Pat Fitzgerald, now after years there as a player, 17 years there as a coach, can no longer call himself that. Was there any part of you at this point that was still surprised when that news finally came down yesterday?
I mean, the only surprising part about this is how everybody's handling it, especially, in all honesty, the Northwestern president, who's a lawyer, by the way, and knows about process, and how he has basically screwed this process up to where there was a 2-week unpaid suspension, which was during a dead period in the summer, which is like nothing, and then saying there was new information, or there was more detailed information coming out, when it looked like it was the backlash that made him rethink the 2-week suspension and then go into a firing. And now Pat Fitzgerald firing back with lawyers saying, wait a minute, how do we go from a 2-week suspension to being fired in this case? So this one isn't over, and it's not over because of, I'm sure, reputation for Pat Fitzgerald, but also money. He's 2 years into a 10-year, $57 million deal. So he's making over $5 million a year, and he had 8 more years of that coming. So now it comes down to the legalese from that side of it. We'll certainly get into the other side of it of is he going to be fired with cause or without cause? With cause means they don't have to pay him, and Pat would have to sue for the money. Without cause means they come to some kind of settlement on the amount of money owed, blah, 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 blah. So a lot of it is about that. But I'll say this, Mike, because there's a lot of people on Twitter coming out and saying, I know Pat Fitzgerald. Pat Fitzgerald's a great guy. I can't believe any of this. And listen, I've known Pat for a few years, and Pat, I think he's a really nice guy, but I don't know the inner workings of what's going on there. And he has said, even in the statement after being fired, he brought up the fact of the lady who did the investigation in saying that Pat didn't know what was going on, so that's why I was suspended for 2 weeks. Next thing you know, I'm fired. And why am I fired? And I'll look at a tweet that I saved from a guy named John Mancuso. Okay, and this is kind of where, because people are going to say, did they have to fire him? Why did they fire him? Blah, those that are on Pat Fitzgerald's side. And this tweet says they had to fire him. There's no way he possibly can recruit kids and tell the parents, I will protect your child and do what is right for them during this time at the university. He can say he had no knowledge, but if he didn't, that's a problem. And he had no control of the program. And so in the big picture, that's the way I look at it. A lot of people are going to say, did he deserve to be fired if he didn't know what was going on? And this comes down to this same old question. How much should the head coach know what's going on in his program, right? We know as parents, we tried to know what you and Jake and Sydney were always doing. And in all honesty, there's no way we knew everything you guys were doing if you didn't want to tell us, right? But it's our job to know and be responsible for you guys. And for a coach, multiply that by a ton for the number of players a coach is responsible for, of trying to know everything. So for those that are saying, well, he can't possibly know everything, so how can you fire him if an investigation shows he didn't know? But to the point of that tweet, I think this is the way it had to go, even if he had zero knowledge of what was going on. Because I agree, college sports is about bringing in the 18-year-olds, no matter what sport it is. That's the lifeblood of your program. And how are you going to sit in a living room and say, come to my school, I'll take care of your child, and the parents saying, well, wait a minute. I mean, look what's going on there under your watch. Yes, but the investigation said I didn't know anything about it. And a parent would say, well, that's a problem too if you don't know what's going on in your program. So I understand the fact that even if Pat didn't know, and there are those that aren't going to believe it, will we ever find out the truth? And we may, if this thing goes to court, because there's this thing called discovery, and then there may be witnesses that really that now you're talking about perjury if you in fact are lying. So we may find out more, but I can understand it'd be very difficult for Pat to go into a living room and try and convince parents and a kid to come to that school and say, I have everything under control there.
I'll say this about what coaches do and don't know. They know a lot. Like, we had coaches that would know what guys were out at Thursday night spots at bars. Like, they have ways of finding out what's going on with their team because they're control freaks. They're all micromanagers. They all find a way to try and control whatever part of the program they can. So the notion that he didn't know about it, again, we can't prove right now, but does feel far-fetched. And you're right, there's a no-win situation there, right? Where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, that you're not going to get out of. And that is the burden that comes with being the person in charge of all this. And so I do think, and this is where we can have a conversation about where the president fits into all of this, right? Because as a general rule of thumb, if you're not an alum of the school, you shouldn't know the president's name at a university. That's not someone that you should readily know. And now Michael Schill is going to be a name who is 10 months into the job, by the way, taking over as Northwestern's president here. You should not know his name. And that same idea of you're either coaching it or allowing it to happen, essentially what this boils down to, applies to Michael Schill. Because through this timeline, you mentioned he is the one, and he said this in his statement firing Pat Fitzgerald. Ultimately, there are other people I heard from. This decision comes down to and was made by me. He was the one that originally decided to suspend him for 2 weeks in a way that seems like they hoped people wouldn't notice because it's Northwestern, because it's the summer, because it's the dead period in the offseason, and they'd be able to sweep it under the rug, or the independent investigators that they hired weren't able to uncover the same amount of information that the student newspaper on campus uncovered. Either way seems like a bit of a problem in your process and seems like somebody ought to answer for that. Like, Dad, if we're going to hold Pat Fitzgerald accountable in the ways that we mentioned, make sense that are understandable given the situation, I don't know how Michael Schill isn't facing some of those same questions here. I've seen people say, well, you can change your mind, you can make better decisions. If he had made a better decision at the beginning of this process, actually punished Pat Fitzgerald in a way that was in accordance with what was accused here and the allegations that were brought forward here, there's a decent chance Pat Fitzgerald still has his job right now. And I'm sure that's something that Pat Fitzgerald is going to bring up with in his beef in this entire process, is how it was handled. Now, Pat Fitzgerald agreed to that suspension initially, because who wouldn't agree to just 2 weeks? But I do think we're going to spend a lot of time looking at Michael Schill now that Pat Fitzgerald's been fired. So, Dad, with Pat Fitzgerald, I think you can kind of boil it down to this is going to be about who knew what and when, right? We've talked about that relative to Pat Fitzgerald about what he did or didn't know. But now going forward, I don't think we're done with people who could potentially be in the firing line here. And Michael Schill, the university president, it's going to be about what he knew and when, right? He said himself in the statement where he filed Pat Fitzgerald, this isn't about one player's agenda or one player's motives. We had 11 players who spoke with the independent investigator during this time period. Because that investigation was confidential, I just learned certain specific details like the identity of the players involved and things like that. But, Dad, it's going to be about, did he know the sexual nature of these allegations when he made the 2-week decision? Did he know the full scope and severity of that when he made the 2-week decision originally that he said, I went back and rethought of and made a mistake on? Or did he find that out again because of the student newspaper who pried those details loose that somehow their independent investigator wasn't able to unearth for whatever reason, which would almost be a bigger red flag to me? And so, again, either way you slice that, I don't know how the university president comes out of this looking like someone who's competent enough to be at the wheel of this going forward.
Yeah, and then there's the AD, Derek Gregg, who I know Pat and his family had a meeting with the team on Monday night, and Gregg was out of the country, so I think he zoomed into it. Schill wasn't there. So I agree with you, because a lot of people are going to ask, what about the AD? Well, this goes beyond the AD to the president. So this is falling in Schill's lap. And it'll be interesting going forward on what more comes out, because now are we going to enter a legal phase? And so some of the things, as everybody tries to play amateur lawyer, I mean, the amount of people with law degrees who really don't have law degrees but think they do on Twitter is amazing. But there are some things that I actually found out from legal people. And one of the first things is what's in this contract as far as going to court. Because a lot of times in a contract, it will say that you go through mediation or arbitration and not court. And so I don't know what's in this contract. You know, do you have to go through that? Or can you go through court? And do you want it to go into court? Because then, as we talked about earlier, there's discovery, there's witnesses. And does Pat Fitzgerald want witnesses up there? And conversely, does the school want witnesses up there as well to sit there and talk about in court of what they went through as student athletes for that university? So do they want all that? People want to know the truth. But from Pat's side, if it's bad, and if it's the school side, if it's bad, do they want any of that becoming public, or do they work out some kind of, some kind of a thing between the two of them so it doesn't go to court?
Yeah, I have a feeling because of how much the school and how much Schill screwed up the initial version of this punishment, they're going to end up having to cut Coach Fitzgerald a check. And so I think that's going to be the reality. But, Dad, the reality going forward now for this program is also fascinating because the fire was rising the morning before this news got announced, too, right? You had the Northwestern Daily reporting allegations from former players in the early 2000s of a racist culture around the team, black players and Latino players saying they didn't feel like they could be themselves. They felt like there was a culture that emphasized whiteness, all this thing that was starting to build up. And, oh, by the way, Dad, the other part of this that's hard to ignore is Northwestern had won 4 games in the last 2 years. It looked like an abject disaster. They had 1 win on not even on American soil last season and had been trending downward outside of the pandemic season for a while in a way that I'd imagine was also a part of the calculus in some of this decision because Pat Fitzgerald and this program hadn't been successful a while. And there's a wonder now of who takes over. I think the defensive coordinator is sort of acting as the head coach right now, but has not been named the head coach, going to allow for them to search for more. But what kind of job this is now with all of this in mind is going to become a really different proposition for Northwestern.
So what should happen, in my opinion, because we're, weeks away from fall camp starting. David Braun is the new defensive coordinator. He came from North Dakota State this year. So the reason it should be his job for now is he's not associated with this program, right? There's a lot of coaches on the coaching staff who have been here through these years with Pat Fitzgerald. So did they know what was going on? So are you just putting someone in charge who was part of this toxic culture if these coaches knew? So Braun, I think, is the obvious choice. He has not been here. He is not part of any kind of past for this. So at least for this year, I think it would be, in my opinion, crazy to bring in somebody completely new who hasn't been in. Braun, even though he hasn't been there a long time, has put his system in since he got there in January and knows what the offense looks like a little bit, obviously, because he's been there a few months. You can't bring in someone completely new just a few weeks before training camp. So I think it'll be Braun's job as the interim head coach, and then we'll see what happens after the year is over.
Yeah, I think that's going to end up being the move. And I mean, the timeline of that, a July coaching search doesn't seem like something that's going to bear a lot of fruit for you, especially given the soil you're trying to plant in right now. And Dad, you brought up before the people rushing to the defense of Pat Fitzgerald right now because they've had positive interactions with him. We've seen, the letter from the team, a letter from a former manager on the team, people speaking out on Twitter, folks in the media, our colleagues. And it's one of those things that's worth reminding in this spot. Pat Fitzgerald can mean a lot of really positive things to a lot of people and have still screwed up here and have still done more here and should be held accountable for what went on inside the building where he sets the standard. All those things can be true at once. And I understand all those people that feel like the man that they know or claim to know could not be capable of these things. But especially for us in the media, for people that work around this, it's a reminder you only know these people so much. You only know these programs so much. And like anything else, a person can be a lot of things at once.
Well, listen, people that in our business that say they know them like we know coaches, right? You call games, you're around college football all the time. You know some coaches way better than other coaches. Same with me. I would as well in college and in the NFL. But that's what you know them as. That's why I always, when I talk to the younger kids and who they look up to, I say, be careful of looking up to a player, because while you see what that player does, you don't know that player. And while we interact with these coaches, some more than others, and like I said, I've interacted with Pat, and he was always a great guy to me. We got along extremely well. But you're right, those things aren't mutually exclusive. You can be, a great guy and have screwed up in a situation as well. So to just blindly defend somebody and saying there's no way he could have done it when you just kind of know them on the surface, I think would be a bit naive.
Yeah, you can be a great guy to some and not to others, and you're certainly not infallible, and that's the bottom line. All right, so Dad, we will see what continues to happen with the situation around Northwestern, as, like you talked about, Pat Fitzgerald has lawyered up and got ready to go. Worth noting, I saw Andy Staples from On Three tweet this yesterday, that apparently the law firm retained by Fitzgerald, Winston and Strawn, is the same law firm that employs the attorney who led the case to the NCAA's 9-0 defeat in Supreme Court. So take that for whatever it's worth, but he's certainly not done with this situation. But Dad, ultimately, I think one that resonated with a lot of people too, and especially a lot of players, because it did involve the locker room, right? This place that's supposed to be. And they even said in this story, part of the reason Fitzgerald had this plausible deniability was because he said the locker room belonged to the players. And while college locker rooms, there are 85 plus or 80 something scholarship guys there, can be up to 120 players on a team with walk-on players. It's a big ecosystem. They will probably never all be perfect. There's too many bodies in there for someone not to have a bad time, but for something to be this pervasive in the place that's supposed to be the most comfortable area for you to interact with your teammates. It is supposed to be your safe haven during the program. It is supposed to be your space. And for this to have infiltrated it in a way that, listen, my experience in locker rooms is only mine. I can't speak for every locker room everywhere, but in, talking to other guys from different programs and stuff, like, I want to stress people, this is not something that happens all over the place. As someone said to me yesterday, hazing is when you give somebody like a dumb haircut or make them sing the fight song or something like that. It's not this. This is bullying. This is so far over the line in a way that I want to make abundantly clear is not happening in a bunch of places.
Yeah, because I saw a lot of that on Twitter as well, that are like, oh, these, guys are just being guys. It's just hazing, it's just in fun. No, I mean, some of this crosses the line, and you're right, and it should be said, because I've been obviously in college locker rooms and pro locker rooms as well, and nothing ever approached this. We did the haircuts, we did the singing, and that's as far as it went. I mean, so to sit there and say, oh, this happens everywhere, there might be some form of, when you use the word hazing, that sounds like it's crossing the line. Some form of whatever word you want to use. If you want to use hazing, that's fine. That is done. But my God, I mean, reading about this, it's well beyond the line. And to your point about the locker room, most coaches want the locker room to be the players, whether it's college, whether it's the NFL, both of them. They want the players to have their space. But especially in college, there's somebody outside, involved with the staff. I don't know whether it's a coach, whether it's the coach's right-hand man, somebody knows outside of the players of what's going on, gets the pulse of the team. Like you said, knows where the players go out on Thursday nights, to what bars, knows the people that they're hanging out with. There's somebody on a staff that knows that. Now, whether you choose to tell the coach about it, because then there's your plausible deniability, or do they have that person just try and handle it? To think that if this stuff was going on, that somebody outside of just the players would have known about it, seems real to me. That somebody's going to know when things like this are going on, that there are those people who it is their job to know the pulse of the locker room, that are going to know that something like this is going on.
Yeah, I'd agree. So it's been an ugly situation, and something that I know, listen, everyone will be happy to put in the rear view when it comes to college football season and getting back to the actual nature of the sport. But it's the important stuff, because especially, Pat Fitzgerald and this program have touted themselves as developers of young men. And even in a statement yesterday talked about, what he believes they have done in sending young men into the world capable of being great fathers and husbands and all that stuff. Like, this is still about protecting the most vulnerable portion of your locker room population, right? Like, I had a coach that always said, you guys lead from the front and we'll worry about leading from the back, meaning, hey, you guys set the standard and we'll work on picking up the people that are falling short of that right now, or the people that are struggling with that right now. Like, it's about protecting the people that are most vulnerable. And when that doesn't happen, somebody has to be held accountable for it. And in this case, that's what ended up happening.